Good evening, everyone. Apologies for starting late. I was having too much fun with my friend Muna. All right. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Sylvia Morales, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director for the Resource Center for Nonviolence, a place dedicated to the principles of Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community, to engage in a conversation of paramount importance. That doesn't make sense, sorry. It is my profound honor to introduce a luminary in the field of Middle Eastern studies, nonviolent action, Dr. Stephen Zunes. Dr. Zunes, a professor of politics and international studies, has pioneered the Middle Eastern Studies program at the University of San Francisco. His body of work provides clarity on critical issues often clouded by conflict and misunderstanding. As a leading scholar in U.S. Middle East policy and strategic nonviolent action, Dr. Zunes has been a formidable voice in advocating for a more just and peaceful world. Sorry, I'm out of breath, I ran over here. His contributions to our understanding of Middle Eastern politics, U.S. foreign policy, international terrorism, and the intricacies of nuclear non-proliferation are not just scholarly pursuits. They are pillars in the fight of human rights and the embodiment of strategic nonviolent action. Dr. Zunes' role as a senior policy analyst for the Foreign Policy in Focus project and his role as an editor for journals like Peace Review and Tikkun have further solidified his position as a thought leader in this complex and vital field. The breadth of Dr. Zunes' scholarship, including his seminal works like Tinderbox, U.S. Middle East Policy and the Roots of Terrorism, Nonviolent Social Movements, and Western Sahara, War, Nationalism, and Conflict Irresolution, offer us profound insights into the dynamics of global conflict and the power of peaceful resolution. His commitment to educating and empowering the next generation of peacemakers is evident in his academic fieldwork, crossing continents, and influencing policy. As we delve into tonight's topic, Shadows of War, Decoding the U.S. Role in the Israel-Palestine Conflict, we are reminded of the critical need for a deep and nuanced understanding of such complex issues. Dr. Zunes' analysis offers us a lens through which we can examine the U.S. role in this prolonged conflict, a perspective that is essential in our pursuit of the beloved community, a community rooted in justice, peace, and equal rights for all. In these times, when the world grapples with unprecedented challenges, a voice like Dr. Zunes's is not just important, it is essential. His work, aligning with the values of the Resource Center for Nonviolence, reminds us that understanding, dialogue, and strategic nonviolent action are key to creating a world that honors the dignity and worth of all peoples and our beloved planet. Friends and community, without further ado, join me in giving a warm welcome to a true champion of peace, justice, Dr. Stephen Zunes.
Thank you for that very warm and generous introduction. It's a real honor to be here in Scott Kennedy Hall because back in 1981, I just recently graduated from college, and I was working on Israeli-Palestinian issues for the Friends Peace Committee, a Quaker organization, part of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. And I was invited to go on a study tour to Israel and Palestine, which also included time in Egypt and Lebanon, led by a fellow by the name of Scott Kennedy. And it's amazing. He led 41 trips to Israel-Palestine in his lifetime, and brought so many people to the awareness of the importance of what was going on there. And Scott's role, and that of RCNV, was really singular because at that time, virtually no multi-issue peace group even dared touch Israel and Palestine. There are a few Quakers, a few left-wing Jews, you know, but not much beyond that. And so, Scott really was a model about why this is a peace issue, why we should address it, even though we might get yelled at and called all sorts of names, and it might impact our funding and everything else. He was one who really saw how critical it was that it be addressed not from an ideological perspective of, you know, pro or anti-Zionist or this or that or the other, but from the very values that had made peace activists active around Vietnam, around Central America, around many of the other issues around the world that have inspired us. So I really appreciate the fact that I am here tonight in Scott Kennedy Hall at the Resource Center for Nonviolence. I just want to start off by an observation about how isolated the United States is in the world over the current conflict in Gaza. The United States, on three occasions in recent months, has wielded its veto power to block otherwise unanimous UN Security Council resolutions and had substantially weakened the one that was allowed to pass. In the United Nations General Assembly, of the 193 member states, only 10 voted no. The United States, Israel, several Pacific Island nations that are economically dependent on the United States, and a couple far-right governments, populist governments like Hungary. The Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Orthodox Church, and the vast majority of mainline Protestant denominations have called for a ceasefire. Only the right-wing fundamentalists are supporting Israel to fight on. 68% of Americans, including 80% of Democrats, support a ceasefire. Virtually every human rights group, peace group, liberal organization that's taken a stand has called for a ceasefire. Yet there are those who insist, including apparently a majority of our city council, that Biden and Netanyahu are right and everybody else is wrong. And Biden has gotten by with this with the same kind of lies that we've heard all about Vietnam, about Central America, about Iraq. For example, insisting that he had pictures, evidence that Hamas had beheaded babies. Now, Hamas did all sorts of terrible things on October 7th, but they later admitted they, in fact, did not have such photos. There was no such evidence. The Israelis have admitted they didn't have such evidence. He insisted that the U.S. had evidence that Al-Shifa Hospital, the main Gaza hospital, is a command and control center for Hamas. Well, the Washington Post did an investigation, came out about a week ago, that said there's absolutely no evidence that that was the case. He insisted that the civilian death rate, the casualties, were being exaggerated. But we now know from the United Nations that, if anything, they have been undercounted because there's still a lot of people under the rubble. They have not recovered. And he's also insisted that the high civilian death toll is because Hamas is using human shields, yet to find a single Palestinian death due to human shields, which are defined as keeping somebody against their will, essentially hostage, making them as a deterrent to being attacked. Hamas has had some equipment and personnel too close to civilian areas, which is a lesser war crime, but no human shields. But he's using that definition in part because Congress, in a resolution primarily sponsored by Nancy Pelosi, redefined human shields back about 10 years ago in reference to Gaza, saying that Hamas uses human shields by putting its officials and fighters in civilian neighborhoods and civilian hospitals, etc. But Hamas, in addition to being having a terrorist arm and the Al-Qassam brigades, is also the government of Gaza. And people who work for the government there, like most government workers, they live in civilian neighborhoods. They go to civilian hospitals. Similarly, Hamas is a militia. They don't have They don't have permanent military bases. Their fighters live at home. And so what Pelosi and a huge bipartisan majority of Congress and what the Biden administration has said is basically all of Gaza is a free fire zone, because by definition, Hamas people live everywhere, and they go to the hospitals and mosques and whatever, and so therefore these are legitimate targets. Even though, of course, international humanitarian law says that is completely unfair, completely untrue. In fact, even if they were using human shields in the narrow legal definition of the term, the Fourth Geneva Convention is clear that you still can't attack. I mean, for example, let's take a domestic example. If a bank robber there's a botched bank robbery, and so the bad guys were holding bank employees and customers hostage and were shooting from behind them out into the street, the SWAT team couldn't go in and kill everybody and say, oh, it's not our fault. They were using human shields. And yet the Biden administration's narrative is generally being taken uncritically in the mainstream media. And I'm talking about Biden now because there is no way Israel will be able to engage in its ongoing slaughter of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, maintain its occupation of the West Bank, its repression, its colonization of the West Bank and the Golan, nor could it get away with the kind of war crimes we've seen not just in Gaza, but in Lebanon and the West Bank and elsewhere, were it not for the unconditional military, financial, and diplomatic support of the United States. As citizens of the United States, we have more power to influence our own government than we do foreign governments. I mean, back in the 1980s, during the slaughter in El Salvador, we generally did not protest before the Salvadoran embassy or Salvadoran consulates. We protested at U.S. government buildings because we recognized that as horrible as the Salvadoran regime may have been, they were only able to engage in these massacres and repression as a direct result of U.S. support. Without the constant veto of the United States has vetoed no less than 46 UN otherwise unanimous Security Council resolutions directed at Israel, which is more than any country has vetoed on any issue by far in the history of the United Nations. If there wasn't for these vetoes, Israel would be subjected to international sanctions and other pressures as other occupiers and others who have flaunted international law, and have long ago forced them to end the occupation. I mean, Israel engages in the kinds of repressive policies and violations of its international legal responsibilities because it can. Any other country in a hostile region, given such a blank check, would probably do the same sorts of things. And so that's why I tend not to focus my advocacy, my work, my analysis on critiquing Zionism or talking about how uniquely terrible Israel is or anything like that. Because really, Israel gets away, can do this because the United States makes it possible. Now, one would expect this kind of policies under Reagan, a Bush, or a Trump, but this is taking place under a Democratic administration. And I'm hard-pressed to think of any issue where there's been such a difference between rank-and-file Democrats and their elected leaders. And I'm talking about both the Biden administration and congressional Democratic leadership. We should have seen this coming. Now, as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Biden was the most fanatic supporters of Israel's right-wing government. He attacked George W. Bush from the right when Bush criticized Israel for its settlement expansion and for the use of death squads against in the West Bank, which, while some of it targeted terrorists, also targeted many nonviolent activists as well. If you look at the he also attacked the International Court of Justice. He attacked Amnesty International. He took a very hard-line position. And his people primarily wrote the 2020 Democratic Platform, and they rejected calls by moderate pro-Israel groups like J Street to criticize the occupation by name, and instead sided with right-wing pro-Israel groups like AIPAC to not even mention it. And there's no criticism in the platform against the network of more than 250 illegal settlements Israel has established in the West Bank and other occupied territories in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, a series of UN Security Council resolutions, and a landmark ruling by the International Court of Justice. The draft does, however, criticize international civil society campaigns to boycott companies and other entities supporting Israeli occupations and the occupation settlement. The platform also rejected calls by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's delegates for supporting Israel as a state for all its citizens, instead inserting language emphasizing support of Israel as a Jewish state. The explicit opposition in the platform to boycotts, divestment, and sanctions is particularly striking, given that only 15% of Democrats familiar with the BDS campaign oppose it. And the clear favoritism towards Israel relative to Palestine in the document contrasts with the views of close to 90% of Democrats who believe the United States should either favor the Palestinians or take a more neutral stance in the peace process. And despite the platform's insistence that Israel remain a Jewish state, 81% of Democrats favor Israel's democracy more than its Jewishness. That is, they believe should a two-state solution no longer be possible as a result of the continued Israeli colonization of the West Bank, which many people believe is already the case, they would, quote, support a single democratic state in which Arabs and Jews are equal, even if that means Israel would no longer be a politically Jewish state. 75% of Democrats believe U.S. military aid to Israel, like any other country, should be conditional on human rights and international law. Among young Democrats, it's closer to 90%. This is one reason that Biden has declared emergency powers to send billions of dollars of offensive aid, including, Hellfire missiles and the very thing, and the dumb bombs that have been killing all these civilians, by bypassing normal public and congressional oversight. And the Democratic platform, I should mention, called for sending up to $38 billion in unconditional aid in the coming years. Said this is an ironclad commitment. And Biden is upping that by an additional $14 billion over that. During the primaries, when Sanders, Warren, and Buttigieg called on conditioning aid to Israel, Biden called it bizarre to even suggest that and compared it to kicking France out of NATO. So we saw, and many of us saw this coming. And it's a real shame that more Democrats didn't see it coming as well, that they chose him over more progressive candidates. Now, I mentioned how the polls show that over two-thirds of Americans, including 85% of Democrats, support a ceasefire. But not only does Biden reject that, but only a few dozen members of Congress have come to support it. And despite testimony before our city council a couple of days ago, it was more than 5-1 in favor of a resolution calling for a ceasefire, the city council voted 5-2 to defeat such a resolution. Now, Biden says he's for a two-state solution, but he's pressing more countries to recognize Israel. In fact, he's now established a special office in the State Department whose sole purpose is to try to get more Arab countries to unilaterally recognize Israel, trying to change their previous stance. They will recognize Israel as soon as the occupation ends. And there's a Palestinian state alongside Israel. He's getting them, really pushing them along the so-called Trump's Kushner's, so-called Abraham Accords. Biden's a big advocate of Kushner's peace plan. Meanwhile, the U.S. is actively discouraging countries from recognizing Palestine. Indeed, he says that the U.S. will withdraw any funding from any UN agency that has Palestine as a member. And remember, 138 states have recognized Palestine as an independent state. Of course, Biden has repeatedly condemned Palestinian attacks on Israeli civilians while defending Israeli attacks on Palestinian civilians. He defends the UN's role in the establishment of an Israeli state, but he opposes any UN role in the establishment of a Palestinian state. He says a Palestinian state could only happen under terms agreed to by Israel, when the Israeli government has explicitly ruled out any kind of Palestinian state whatsoever. He says that Israel should control at least 78% of historic Palestine, but insists the Palestinian demands for the remaining 22% is too much, and they should learn to compromise. Now, the Biden administration has no objections to the Israeli government, including cabinet members who oppose Israel's right to exist, including, in fact, pretty much the entire cabinet opposes Israel's right to exist, including the prime minister. But Biden threatens to cut off all relations with the Palestine Authority if they have even one cabinet member who doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist. Now, when Trump moved the embassy, moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which many people saw as essentially recognizing it as being all Israelis, this multi-ethnic, multi-religious city. A president doesn't normally have that power, but a bill was passed in Congress several years earlier that gave a president that special power. The author of that bill was Senator Joe Biden. And of course, he has not moved the embassy back. And indeed, he's supported Trump's decision to close down the consulate in East Jerusalem, which dealt with the Palestinians, had been in existence since the 1930s. Indeed, if you look at the Democratic platform, it says Jerusalem should remain the capital of Israel, but makes no mention of Palestinians' claims to share the city. Biden has not reversed Trump's recognition of the illegal Israeli settlements. Trump's decision to recognize these illegal Israeli settlements as sovereign Israeli territory, nor has he reversed Trump's recognition of Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan Heights, which even Reagan and the Bushes opposed. And contrast this with Ukraine. He says quite correctly that no country can expand its territory by force, that no country can unilaterally change international boundaries. And yet, yet this is exactly what the United States is doing and recognizing Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan. And of course, I need to mention the fact that the United States has threatened war with Iran because of its nuclear program, even though it's not a nuclear weapons program yet. And Biden was one of the right-wing minority of Democrats who supported the invasion of Iraq on the grounds that Iraq had a nuclear weapons program, which it really didn't. But Israel has a nuclear weapons program. It's had one for years. It's in direct violation of UN Security Council Resolution 487, which even Reagan supported. But in Biden's view, we can just look the other way and even pretend that it doesn't exist. So if you want to know why there is no peace between Israelis and Palestinians, you only have to go as far as the fact that the United States plays the contradictory role of being the chief mediator of the conflict and the chief military, financial, and diplomatic supporter of the stronger of the two parties. And anybody who studied conflict resolution or mediation or anything like that knows that that is a non-starter. That is not going to work. And the U.S. says, the UN should butt out. It's between the two parties to work it out among themselves. But even if you agree that Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs have equal rights to self-determination, to security, to peace, as I do, that ignores the gross asymmetry in power between the occupier, the most powerful country in the region by far, and the people under occupation. It would be like when Iraq invaded Kuwait, we said, oh, you two got to work it out among yourselves about how much of Kuwait Iraq continues to occupy or colonize or exploit or whatever. So Biden is basically saying to the Palestinians, we will oppose, we oppose, obviously, armed struggle, even if it's directed at occupation forces and not terrorism. We oppose diplomatic initiatives at the United Nations or by any other party. We'll veto any resolution critical of Israel. They should not go to the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. And we don't believe we will not withhold any arms or do or aid or any other kind of pressure on Israel. And you can't even engage in nonviolent struggles like boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Trust the peace process, we say, with a partner that's refusing to compromise, a peace process facilitated by the occupier's biggest supporter. In other words, Biden doesn't really support a two-state solution. Whatever his intent, his policies have resulted in the occupation continuing indefinitely. And just as an aside, people try to make excuses so, well, the Palestinians are not unified. It's not just the Palestinian Authority. You have Hamas, you have Islamic Jihad, you have the Popular Front. And some of these groups don't recognize Israel's right to exist. And some of these groups use terrorism, and none of them are particularly democratic. But let's look at the other occupation of a country that a lot of people don't know about, Western Sahara, by Morocco, also a U.S. ally. They are united under the Polisario Front. Not everybody agrees with all their policies, but everybody sees it as their effective government, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. They've been recognized by scores of nations. They're a full member of the African Union. They have never questioned Morocco's right to exist. They've never engaged in terrorism. And they actually have democratic elections for their leadership. And yet the United States is the only country in the world, actually Israel's joined us now recently, to formally recognize Morocco's annexation of the entire country. And indeed, if you look at Rand McNally, Google, Apple Maps, National Geographic, you'll see Morocco and Western Sahara as separate countries, or at most Western Sahara with the hash marks, showing it's occupied. You look at U.S. government maps, it's all one country, no demarcation whatsoever. And so, it makes me believe that even if the Palestinians finally got their act together and did everything right, we wouldn't support their freedom anyway. And and Congress is even worse in certain ways. I mean, I'm not just talking about the Republicans, which are fanatical, that they don't even pretend to support a two-state solution, who are dominated by these religious fundamentalists, but Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic Senate and House leaders, are among the most fanatic pro-Netanyahu people in Congress. And up on that list, the most extreme would be Jimmy Panetta, our congressman. He actually co-authored a bill a few years ago that would have sent somebody to prison for even advocating boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Not just against Israel, but even just against a handful of companies that were supporting the Israeli occupation and settlements. Fortunately, Obama, fortunately, it was it didn't pass, and it would have probably not passed constitutional muster anyway. But this is just about giving you an idea of how extreme that he is. I mean, in the 1980s, if our congressman had taken a similar right-wing position in Central America, there'd be constant vigils, protests, even sit-ins in his office. And yet, Panetta seems to think he can get away with this hard right policy. Unfortunately, our two senators, Padilla and Butler, also oppose a ceasefire, also support unconditional military aid. And again, one of the most hardline extreme people up there with Panetta and Jeffries is Adam Schiff, who is leading Senate candidate for Senate. Some of you may have seen my op-ed in the Santa Cruz Sentinel a couple weeks ago when I contrasted his view with a far more moderate Barbara Lee. and to a lesser extent, Katie Porter. So why the reason, again, I'm saying all this is that, again, I don't want to get in divisive debates about Zionism or whatever. I think we're on a much more solid ground if we really stress human rights and international law, like we did regarding U.S. policy towards Iraq, towards Nicaragua, El Salvador, East Timor. You know, the same issues that divided the Democratic Party in the past, but progressives eventually ended up winning because we made it untenable for Democrats to back Republican foreign policies towards these countries. I reject the term progressive except Palestine. If you support any illegal occupation, if you support unconditional aid to any repressive government, if you rationalize for any war crime, you are not progressive. And you therefore should not get the endorsement of any organization calling itself progressive. And it really drives me crazy that you have these progressive organizations, including groups that emphasize peace and human rights, endorsing candidates who have taken such a hardline position. Now, I think it's going to be less likely this year now. I think people have been mobilized, but historically this has been the case. So what has led to the current tragedy, the horrific Hamas terrorist attacks of October 7th? And I should emphasize that there is absolutely no excuse for them. No matter how oppressed you are, you don't have the right to go and massacre hundreds of civilians. And one of the ironies is that the main targets ended up being these left-wing kibbutzim, where the vast majority opposed Netanyahu and the occupation. I have a friend who was almost killed, who has gotten arrested and beaten up trying to by Israeli occupation forces in the West Bank, trying to protect Palestinian villages from destruction. And also the other big target was the rave. And again, ravers and kibbutzniks are not the kind of people who generally support Netanyahu and the right wing. But regardless of the ideology of the victims, it was totally wrong. But to understand why it happened, you have to look that the peace process was not going anywhere. In fact, Netanyahu just a few weeks earlier said, we can ignore the Palestinians now. The best thing we can do is ignore them. I mean, why should we? They can't do anything about it. The United States isn't pressing us to do anything about it, so we can just ignore them. And looks like these Arab governments are starting to recognize this now, thanks to U.S. pressure, so we don't have to worry about ending our isolation in return for ending the occupation. So he's quite explicit, saying it doesn't matter what happens to the Palestinians anymore. Meanwhile, colonization of the West Bank was continuing, including the destruction of orchards, of towns. These right-wing settler militia were rampaging, killing hundreds of civilians. I mean, again, here's the El Salvador analogy, where the army stands by, where the death squads go and kill people. The Palestine Authority was seen as increasingly inept and corrupt, and essentially were collaborators, jailers in their own prison. And U.S., and since the U.S. wasn't pushing Israel to change its policies and threatening to veto anything the UN did, that's why Netanyahu could say, we can ignore the Palestinians. And what Hamas was essentially saying on October 7th is, no, you can't ignore the Palestinians anymore. Now, again, terrorism, I believe, is both morally reprehensible and a violation of humanitarian law, as well as politically counterproductive. But Israel's used this as an excuse to kill 23,000 people at this point, at least 18,000 of whom were civilians, and at least 8,000 of whom are children. Again, Biden and congressional leaders say it's legitimate self-defense, blame all the deaths on human shields, et cetera, et cetera. But even putting aside the moral and legal arguments, it's not going to work. Think of other times a country has been invaded with large-scale civilian casualties in the name of fighting terrorism. What happened? Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1978 to defeat the terrorist Mujahideen. The result was the rise of the Taliban. Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 to stop the terrorist PLO. A direct outcome of that was the rise of Hezbollah. And of course, in the name of the war on terror, the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, which led to the creation of ISIS. Fighting terror with terror creates more terrorists. I really don't think the traumatized children who survive this and seen their parents and brothers and friends killed are going to be more rational and more peaceful. And despite Biden's calls for restraint, the fact that he is sending Hellfire missiles, bunker buster bombs, and is using his emergency powers to bypass public oversight, and the Leahy amendment makes his calls for restraint just as disingenuous as his call for a two-state solution. But I want to go back a little further about the rise of Hamas. It was on that trip with Scott Kennedy in 1981. We visited Gaza, and we were told by local activists that there was a disturbing trend, the rise of these a reactionary Islamic current in Gaza. Now, the Palestinian nationalist movement at that time were dominated by secular and, in many cases, leftist nationalists. And they pointed out that these right-wing Islamist groups were challenging them for their influence. In fact, they were being quietly supported by both the United States and Israel as a counter to the PLO. I came back and I wrote an article about it for the Progressive magazine. To my knowledge, it's the first article in any major U.S. publication that warned of the rise of this phenomenon. In the final paragraph, I said, if the United States and Israel does not give moderate Palestinian nationalists hope for an end of the occupation and a state of their own, it will only encourage a dangerous reactionary current that will prove to be a far greater threat to Israel. Well, this is, of course, exactly what happened. But when the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993, still only about 15%, according to polls, of Palestinians supported Hamas. Hamas said to the PLO, to Arafat, to the Fatah, they said, you're being naive here. They're not going to give you a state by the end of the decade like they promised. The United States is not going to be an honest broker. They're just going to keep on colonizing with these illegal settlements and make life more difficult. And that's exactly what happened. And again, the corruption of the Palestine Authority, the continued checkpoints and roadblocks and more settlements made life for Palestinians worse and worse. But the Hamas, getting funding from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, other places, were able to set up healthcare clinics and schools and mutual aid and other basic social services that neither Israel nor the Palestinian Authority was providing. And so when they ran in parliamentary elections in 2006, they stunned everybody by getting 44% of their vote. But due to the way things were divided, the districts were, they ended up with a majority in the parliament. Now, Arafat and Fatah still ran the executive branch. They were still the most powerful. It was kind of like, if you know the French political system, it's kind of like the cohabitation when you have one party in the presidency and one party in parliament with the prime minister. So it was functioning okay. But the Bush administration pushed Fatah to stage a coup, to throw out Hamas altogether. Hamas got wind of it and attempted a counter-coup. And there was a 3-day civil war which took place in 2007. And when the smoke cleared, Fatah had control of the urban areas of the West Bank where the Palestine Authority ruled. But in Gaza, Hamas seized control. They immediately started suppressing all opposition, broke the back of the teachers' union, other civil society organizations. They've run it as an authoritarian state ever since. But it's important, this would have never happened if the United States had not attempted this coup. It's a fascinating story. Vanity Fair had a detailed story on it. You can find it online about the Bush administration and how they led to Hamas taking control of the Gaza. So all these horrible wars we've had subsequently in 2011, 2014, 2019, or 2009, and what was happening now would have never happened if the U.S. had not intervened. Indeed, Hamas would have never risen to the power it has at all if we had pressed Israel to make the necessary compromises for peace and allow for a viable two-state solution to happen back in the 90s. Now, I could go on and on about this, but I want to look at the issue about why the United States supports Israel, because if we understand that, we might be able to change things. And I want to start by saying it's not because we are concerned about this democratic Israel, being wiped out by the Arab hordes or whatever. If our concern was Israel's security, we would have sent most of our aid in the first 20 years of Israel's existence, when it was more democratic and most vulnerable strategically. But 99% of U.S. aid has gone to Israel since 1967, when Israel proved itself more powerful than any combination of Arab armies and became an occupier of millions of Palestinians. Indeed, if you look at the trends of U.S. aid, the more repressive Israel's become, the more right-wing Israel's become, the more powerful Israel's become relative to its neighbors, the more the increase in U.S. aid. It's not because of Jewish voters. American Jews have never been more divided on the question of Israel. Never been more divided. Again, aid has increased, support for Israel has increased, as the Jewish community has declined, both in terms of the percentage of the overall U.S. population, but also in terms of the number of Jews who identify as pro-Israel, and for whom strongly identify as Zionists, etc. And indeed, if you look at the congressional districts, some of the most prominent, most fanatic supporters of Israel come from states and districts with relatively small Jewish populations. Furthermore, if you look at the three presidents that shifted U.S. policy most dramatically in support of Israel, Nixon, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump, they got the least Jewish votes of any modern presidents. And I may surprise some of you by saying it is not even about the so-called pro-Israel lobby. Remember, there did not need to be an Indonesian-American lobby to get the United States to support the Suharto regime's brutal 24-year occupation of East Timor, which annihilated a third of that island nation's population. Nor there is a Moroccan-American lobby responsible for U.S. support of Morocco's ongoing occupation of the nation of Western Sahara. We could look at Turkey's occupation of Cyprus, apartheid's occupation in Namibia, where the U.S. also supported the occupier. Unfortunately, the U.S. government is perfectly capable of supporting an allied regime's conquest, occupation, repression, and colonization of neighboring countries without the support of an ethnic lobby. If you look at all issues where there's been a direct conflict between AIPAC, the powerful Israel lobby, and the President of the United States, the President always wins. The Suez Crisis with Eisenhower in 1956, the first Israeli invasion of Lebanon under Carter in 1978, Reagan's AWAC sales to Saudi Arabia in 1981, Obama with the Iran nuclear treaty. I could give other examples. But on foreign policy, the president has that kind of power. A lobby group cannot change that. Mass movements can, but not not just a lobbying group. Now, I'm not saying they don't. AIPAC and the Israel lobby doesn't have influence. Without the lobby, broadly speaking, we would have more allies in Congress. We would have less censorship, more objective media coverage, more open debate. They certainly make it harder to change U.S. policy. But I strongly believe that our policy towards Israel and Palestine would be more or less the same regardless. I mean, does anybody think that without AIPAC, the United States would have a foreign policy in the Middle East committed to human rights and international law? I mean, where have we had that kind of foreign policy anywhere? Think of the genocidal regimes the United States has supported in Central America and Africa and Asia. I mean, just a few years ago, the U.S. was backing Saudi Arabia's bombing of Yemen, which killed, with U.S. aircraft actually refueling Saudi bombers in the air, with U.S. technicians doing the targeting with the sensitive computers there at Saudi air bases, killing tens of thousands of Yemeni civilians. Again, Israel's not unique. I mean, it's certainly not anti-Semitic to challenge the Israel lobby and the Israeli government. It's certainly not anti-Semitic to bemoan the powerful influence they do have. But to imply that they control the U.S. government, are somehow puppeteers, as I've seen some of these memes going on, or that the President and Congress are powerless to stop them, is indeed, I would argue, a rehashing of the old anti-Semitic canard about a cabal of powerful Jews behind the scenes controlling things. Okay, there are, I wish it was just a lobby. It would be a lot easier to counter. But it's much more complicated. And let me look at some of the reasons. First of all, is ideological. And there's both a liberal version and a right-wing version. The liberal version, and this is true people generally of my generation and older, who remember Israel, prior to its conquest in 1967, when Israel was this progressive social democracy, a Sweden in the Middle East, in effect, this idealized version that we saw in Exodus with Paul Newman, and the idea of the plucky kibbutzniks, and it was cool even among non-Jewish students to go and volunteer in the kibbutzim, because of these wonderful socialist, collectives. And there's a really sentiment, and my God, the extermination in Germany. Give these guys a break. Finally they got a state after 2,000 years. They're an oppressed minority. It's kind of a global affirmative action, if you will, to give them this state of their own. I mean, this was really the prevailing, not just liberal, but also socialist, felt that way. Remember, Bernie Sanders lived in Israel for 6 months, worked on a kibbutz. Noam Chomsky worked on a kibbutz. I mean, there was this very idealistic kind of view. And again, I'm seeing some nodding heads from some of the gray hairs in the audience that remember this. How many people saw Israel at the time, and this generation, which is the generation more or less in power in Washington, still kind of have this idealistic vision. It's kind of, and they don't want to hear alternative. There's this cognitive dissonance. They don't want to really. They just can't see it any other way. And it's kind of like certain leftists who want socialist revolutions to succeed so bad and recognize the nature of U.S. imperialism and the lies and the hypocrisy and things like that. So they'll be in denial when a Maduro or an Ortega, start really repressing things and doing nasty things because they assume it's all disinformation and it's all just right-wing whatever, and, we got to stand by them, and, it's a similar thing going on. But don't underestimate the number of good liberals, older liberals who really, sincerely believe in Israel. And, my God, they have LGBTQ rights. What more do you want, And again, I'm seeing some nodding heads of people who probably have friends who are still stuck in this paradigm. The other ideological extreme, of course, comes from the right, and this is from the 40 million self-described evangelical Christians. These right-wing fundamentalists mostly, who see modern Israel as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. They see the battle between Israelis and Palestinians as comparable to that of the Israelites and the Philistines, and we all know whose side God was on. And of course, part of this theology is that that Israel is necessary, in fact, expansive, controlling Israel, controlling everything in the area. The time of King David and Solomon, is necessary for the second coming of Christ. Now, of course, in this theology, when that happens, all the Jews will be condemned to eternal damnation. But Israel's convenient for Act 1, if not Act 2. And a lot of the Zionist groups are fine about Reverend Hagee and these right-wing Christians, even though they are pretty anti-Semitic, because they don't expect that to happen. So, they're cool with them. But they essentially control the Republican Party at this point. I mean, the religious right, essentially is a dominant force there. The primary reason, though, I would say, for U.S. policy, like U.S. foreign policy in general, is strategic. Israel is in the words of one former Secretary of State, our unsinkable aircraft carrier. Arab allies could be overthrown in a coup or revolution, but Israel's there to stay. Israel has kept leftist and Islamist movements in check, not just in Palestine, but in Jordan and Lebanon as well. They provide battle testing for U.S. Military equipment. They trained U.S. forces in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency methods. Israel's funneled U.S. arms to third parties that we couldn't give to directly for political reasons, like apartheid South Africa, the Nicaraguan Contras, the Guatemalan junta, more recently Colombian paramilitaries, and various armed Kurdish groups. The military-industrial complexes of the two countries are closely intertwined in developing new jet fighters, anti-missile defense technologies, and the like. The CIA and Mossad cooperate in intelligence gathering and covert operation. And indeed, if you look at the history of U.S. support for Israel, it reveals that the stronger, more aggressive, and more willing to cooperate with U.S. interests that Israel has become, the higher level of aid and strategic cooperation. A militant Israel is seen to advance American interest. Indeed, an Israel in a constant state of war, technologically sophisticated and military advanced, yet lacking an independent economy and dependent on the United States, is far more willing to perform tasks that might be unacceptable to other allies than would be an Israel at peace with its neighbors. As Henry Kissinger put it, Israel's obstinacy serves the purposes of both our countries best. And what's rather troubling about this is how it parallels historic anti-Semitism. If you look at Europe, back, say, in the Middle Ages, the ruling class of a given country, in return for granting Jews a limited amount of cultural and religious autonomy, would essentially make a deal with certain Jewish leaders saying, okay, in return for this, you can be the visible agents of the oppressive order. You be the moneylenders. You be the tax collectors. Remember, because usury was banned under Christendom, for many centuries. And so when people would rise up against their oppression, people would say, oh no, it's not us, it's the Jews. The Jews are at fault. People would turn on the Jews. You'd have the pogroms, the terrible ways of oppression. Jews would resettle in another country, and the cycle would start all over again. And this went on for centuries, culminating, of course, in the Holocaust. And the idea of Zionism was that if Jews could have a state of their own, they would no longer be dependent on the whims of the ruling class. But the tragic irony is this cycle is being perpetuated on a global scale. For example, when the British and French wanted to get rid of Nasser in 1956, remember they sent in the Israelis, and then when the United States became Israel's primary supporter after the '67 war in the ways I've described and more. Again, using Israel to do the dirty work, and a horrible echo of the past. Autocratic Arab governments, Islamic extremists, and others are blaming Israel and Zionism and the Jews for their problems, rather and leaving it largely untouched the broader exploitative global economic system and their own elites who benefit from and help perpetuate such a system. And you know, I have talked to at least a half dozen Arab foreign ministers and deputy foreign ministers over the years. And every time I've asked them, why are you still so friendly with the United States, given what we're doing to the Palestinians? They say, oh, your ambassador, your State Department explained how the Jews really run U.S. foreign policy, and you can't help it. Sound familiar? You know, it's not us. It's the Jews behind the scenes. I've heard congressional aides, off the record, of course, say, you know, when I say, why is your boss supporting Netanyahu and all these human rights abuses and things like that? He's pretty liberal normally, and says, well, he needs the Jewish money to get elected. You know, again, the old anti-Semitic canard about, oh, Gentiles are not, powerful Gentiles are not responsible, it's the Jews are making them do it. And you know, and what's really what's still I mean, even under and I mean, I've used the analogy of when the United States says, "Oh, we can't push Israel. Israel's our friend." I think you know what does a friend do if someone's their buddy is heading towards from a bar drunk with the car keys in their hand? A friend takes the keys away, say, "I'm not going to let you hurt yourself or others." And when I tell this analogy to my Israeli friends, they're saying, "No, it's not that simple. The U.S. is the bartender. We're the enabler. We're pouring the stuff. We're responsible for this." I mean, I've documented several cases, about a dozen cases, where the U.S. has actually taken a position to the right of the Israeli government, at least when Labor was in power. You know, why did Israel meet the PLO secretly in Oslo back in 1993? Because Clinton refused to allow the PLO to take part in the peace process. He refused to recognize the PLO. He opposed Palestinian statehood. In fact, the deal struck in Oslo was less generous than Clinton's so-called compromise autonomy plan, he put out that same summer. Remember the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006? What a total disaster it was for the Israelis, not to mention the thousands of dead Lebanese civilians and billions of dollars of infrastructure. That was Cheney and Rice's thing. They pushed the Israelis to try to destroy Hezbollah because at that time the U.S. was still seriously considering war with Iran. We wanted to get rid of the ally that could have a deterrent with their missiles. They also wanted Israel to attack Syria. And the General Staff said, this is a bad idea. They vetoed the Syria idea, but reluctantly went ahead with the attack on Lebanon. Again, it was a total disaster for Israel. Hezbollah remained became much stronger as a result. But my point in all this is saying that, again, this is not just a lobby. And we're against the entire foreign policy establishment, the military-industrial complex, the forces of U.S. imperialism that got us into Vietnam, Central America, and Iraq. And this is where we need to focus our energies. Let's not fall into this trap of Middle Eastern exceptionalism. Obviously, there are unique things about it, and I've looked at some of these unique aspects. But again, I really am comfortable with just bashing Israel, even though Israel's doing terrible things, without paying more attention about the role of the United States. And what's scary about the current environment is that even under Reagan and his fueling of these wars in Central America, and even under Bush with the invasion of Iraq, you rarely had people being fired from their jobs or otherwise canceled for their dissent, like you're seeing today around U.S. support for Israel. When I was in grad school under Reagan, I don't recall a single South African solidarity group or Central American solidarity group being banned on a college campus. Under Biden, however, we're seeing Palestine solidarity groups, even those led by Jews, being forcibly disbanded at several universities. We've also seen an unprecedented number of speakers and films canceled, and not just by hardline pro-Hamas types, but by mainstream anti-war activists, by pacifists, by liberals, and others who simply support a ceasefire. And nearly 30 states have passed anti-BDS laws that punish individuals and companies who support boycotting companies that support Israel. And in most of these states, they define Israel as Israel or territories controlled by Israel. So therefore, Ben & Jerry's, for example, which makes ice cream in Israel, sells ice cream in Israel, has no problem with that, but refuses to do it in the Israeli settlements, they are sanctioned, by these states. And similarly, people who advocate sanctions are for example, if I wanted, I found out this recently because I was invited, if I was to speak at a state university in Arkansas, or Texas, or in Florida, any number of states, I'd have to sign a statement. In order to get an honorarium or even airfare, I have to sign a statement saying, I did not boycott Israel. And again, Israel defined as including the occupied territories. The Supreme Court just upheld these laws, and now Texas has followed the laws to basically that makes it illegal to boycott gun manufacturers or carbon emitters. Again, they're using Israel-Palestine as a wedge for a more authoritarian kind of situation, and this is what we're seeing right now. That this combination of the Democratic Party being so far to the right of the vast majority of their constituents, ignoring what people are saying, and this political repression has got me concerned because this may be a trial run for something even worse, like a U.S. war with Iran or Venezuela. Because if they can get away with this, who knows what they think they can get away with in the future. Well, this kind of reminds me very much, I'm old enough to remember, 1968. January 1968, let's think back then, same time of year, of an election year. We had a president who was an experienced senator who had a remarkably progressive domestic policy, but was supporting a foreign policy which thousands of people were being killed and people were outraged about. This time, back then, we had challengers like Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy. We don't have a Gene McCarthy now, or a Bobby Kennedy, or at least a sane one. And we're stuck with this likely choice in November. And, it just kind of reminds me of, you've seen the movie Bulworth, where the kind of centrist Democrat is a senator from California is speaking at a black church in L.A., and he finally is honest and saying, we don't really care what you think or what your needs are, but what are you going to do, vote Republican? And this is kind of what we're being dealt with right here. However, and let me put my political science hat on here, political scientist hat. If the slaughter of Palestinian children in Gaza isn't enough to motivate people to challenge administration policies, let's look at this. The support of Biden and congressional leaders of Israel's war on Gaza appears to have dramatically increased the likelihood of Republican victories in November, including a second Trump presidency. His support among Arab Americans, Biden's support among Arab Americans has gone from 59% to 19%. Biden is now losing in Michigan, a key swing state that has a large Arab American population. Among young voters, his popularity has plummeted down to 25%. 3/4 of young 18 to 30-year-old voters nationwide, not just Democrats, total, 3/4 of young voters nationwide oppose Biden's policy in Gaza. That is higher than that age group opposed Bush's policies in Iraq, Reagan's policies in Central America, and Nixon's policies in Vietnam. Other than LGBTQ issues, I don't know any issue where age and political attitude parallels so much. The young people see Israel differently. Though, again, many progressives saw Israel of our generation as a national liberation moment for Jews. Today's young people see it as a colonial settler state. They are more diverse ethnically. They identify more with people of color because more young Americans are people of color. They are aware of institutionalized racism to an unprecedented degree and indigenous rights. Not surprisingly, there's a lot more sympathy for the Palestinians. And, you know, I'm hearing my students, my adult children, and their friends saying, I'm not voting for Genocide Joe. Now, it won't make it much of a difference here in California. I mean, Biden will win by 5 million votes or something like he did last time. But in swing states, it really could. One thing we've seen in recent elections, when youth turnout is high, Democrats win. When youth turnout is low, Democrats lose. We saw it happen to Hubert Humphrey in 1968. We saw it happen to John Kerry in 2004. When the United States was waging unpopular wars, young people were outraged, and the Democrats nominated a pro-war candidate, even when the majority of Americans by that point, not just young Americans, but the majority of Americans overall opposed the wars. And we had these two well-qualified liberal Democrats lose to weak Republican opponents by a very, very narrow margin. Now, the threat of a Trump victory, could get enough Democrats to change their minds at the last minute, but it's a pretty high risk. But I think what's most crucial is to make sure that the Biden and the Democrats aren't still supporting Israel come November to the degree that they are now. And we've seen many examples in the past where the majority of Americans recognized the U.S. foreign policy was wrong and have worked to change it. They've not always been complete victories, but major reversals in policies which could not have taken place otherwise. In Vietnam, South Africa, Central America, the arms race, Angola, Afghanistan, Iraq, even East Timor. And I really believe that we can do it with Israel and Palestine as well. Thank you. Okay, I'm open for questions. Just two announcements briefly. I thought I'd gotten rid of them all, but I got a box from Ralph Nader, actually, a little while back, who apparently still had copies of my book Tinderbox, which came out in early 2000, late 2002, early 2003. Talks about the roots of terrorism in U.S. foreign policy. There's a big chunk on U.S. policy towards Israel that looks at the historic period up to that time. So it's very dated. I'm selling it for only $5 out there if you want to take it. Also, I have an email list. I have a periodic. I once a month or every other month, I will send out my latest articles. They're not, only occasionally will they be an academic article. Most of them are like policy briefs, op-eds, short analysis pieces, quite digestible. So if you want to be on that email list, please sign up as you leave. Open for questions. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, very, very much. This is about the supposed good old days, but I mean, it's kind of like Israel isn't what it used to be, and it never was. that I think that there was this kind of, idealism. And I think it's the fact that even fairly progressive people were pretty oblivious about issues of racism and colonialism and that kind of thing. I mean, people were so excited about the kibbutzim and kind of ignored the fact it was on stolen land. There was the Nakba. I mean, that's what we now call ethnic cleansing. And there are all sorts of discriminatory laws and even within the remaining Palestinian population in Israel. So there was a lot of nasty stuff going on even then, but it's certainly gotten a lot worse by almost any measure. And Israel's gotten, though American Jews have gotten more and more progressive regarding Israel, Israeli Jews have been going in the opposite direction. And part of it was the myth put by Israeli leaders and by the U.S. government that the Israelis offered the Palestinians everything back in 2000 and they turned it down. The Rocks plan was nothing close to, it was further than any Israeli government had gone before or since, but it was far short of Israel's obligations under international law in terms of a viable Palestinian state. What happened there and the Israeli plan has been deliberately misconstrued. But that did leave a lot of Israelis to move to the right and kind of give up on making peace with the Palestinians. But the other factor is just demographic. That liberal and secular Israelis tend to have small families, and the right-wing Orthodox nationalists, have big families, and it doesn't take long for that to change the demographics, especially when it seems like half my Israeli friends, who tend to be on the left, seem to have at least one adult kid who's immigrated to Berlin or Los Angeles or somewhere just to get the hell out of Israel because it's becoming so right-wing and religious and ultra-religious and everything else. Yes, things are definitely worse, but again, there were some contradictions, there were problems and terrible racist and other things going on from the get-go. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Well, one thing, if you haven't noticed, the city council is not as progressive as it used to be, overall. Okay, not just this. Okay, so that's probably the main reason, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, there are liberals who, again, have this thing about Israel, that they're unwilling to be as critical and as reflective as they may be on other issues. So those are the two reasons that I can think of. But frankly, I was surprised. I really did think, especially since San Francisco, Oakland, others have passed similar resolutions, and it was a really balanced resolution. I mean, I thought it was very well written, and condemned terrorism, called the release of the hostages. I mean, it checked all the boxes you would think. So yeah, I was very, very disappointed. In fact, I'm pretty pissed off. I really am. Regarding the question of genocide, genocide is one of those rare words where the legal definition is actually broader than the popular definition. Genocide does not just mean mass extermination like the Holocaust, like the Armenian genocide, like the Rwandan genocide. It can mean any kind of mass killing, including in counterinsurgency war, where there's little distinction between the military and the civilian population. So by that definition, there have been a number of genocides. Serbia's war in Kosovo, the Guatemalan junta's assault on the Indians of the highlands during the 1980s, what both the Iraqis and the Turks have done to the Kurds, during the late 80s, early 90s. And of course, Vietnam. Remember Holly Near's song, "No More Genocide in My Name"? Yeah, it's, so by that definition, yes, indeed, Israel is engaged in genocide. And South Africa has made a very strong case in the International Court of Justice to that effect, I think, in the past couple of days. I tend not to use the term just because it can be triggering for some Jews who think you are, saying that it's like the Holocaust. And I do think references to the Holocaust in reference to, relative to Israeli treatment of the Palestinians is unfair and wrong, and again, unnecessarily triggering. So I tend to avoid using the word genocide for that reason. But I think there's a strong legal case, to say that Israel is indeed engaged in a genocidal war. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, about what in terms of what could be a result of the a ruling of the World Court that is indeed genocide. The World Court doesn't have our decisions are legally binding, but they're not enforceable. And the United States has made very clear that they insist that Biden's spokesperson said this is totally without merit, this is outrageous, and even while he's been simultaneously pushing for the ICC and to go after Russia for its war crimes. Again, the classic double standard. And the other, when the International Court of Justice ruled unanimously, say for the U.S. judge, that that Israel could build a separation wall along its internationally recognized border because it had genuine security concerns, but could not build it in a serpentine fashion deep inside the West Bank to incorporate these illegal settlements, they were viciously attacked by both President Bush and then John Kerry, who was then the Democratic nominee for president, and Senator Joe Biden. He said that the World Court was opposed to Israel's right to self-defense, and they were supporting terrorism, and da. So I think the Biden administration, if the court does rule in favor of South Africa's petition, would do whatever he could to undermine it. And I do find it significant that it is South Africa. They have some harsh feelings because in the final 15 years of apartheid, Israel was the white minority regime's closest ally, violating international sanctions and everything else to prop it up. And they even co-tested a nuclear weapon together. And South Africa has experienced apartheid. And again, apartheid was a word I was reluctant to use until I read the detailed investigations by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Israeli group Bet Salam, and it does indeed meet the legal definition of apartheid, though it's obviously not the same as South African apartheid, but it's definitely apartheid. And if anyone's been to the West Bank, as I have, it sure as hell looks like apartheid, with these Jewish-only roads and Jewish-only settlements, and Palestinians having special passes to go from one place to the other. I mean, yeah, it's very much and Israeli Jews having in the West Bank go to civil courts, Palestinians arrested in the West Bank go to military courts, water rights. I mean, you go down the list. It's definitely an apartheid system. I don't quite use the word apartheid state. But again, it's maybe a little precise, but certainly it is a kind of apartheid system. And so, yeah, again, I think there's significance in South Africa leading this. I also, frankly, as an aside, I find it significant that the chief lawyer on the South African side is Irish, and the chief lawyer for the Israelis is British. Yeah, well, the Houthis are a rebel group based among the Yazidis in the northern part of the country. They ended up seizing about 2/3 of the country in that multi-sided civil war, which unfortunately the U.S. also had a hand in by undermining the efforts to form a democratic coalition government. But that's another story. But the Houthis are not very popular in Yemen. The only reason they were able to take over, despite being a minority, is that the rest of the Yemenis are so divided into other factions of various things. But they're allied with Iran. They are not a proxy of Iran. I hate it when I read this. I mean, Iran does have proxy militia in Iraq and Syria, which really do, take their orders from the Revolutionary Guard. Iran has had long-standing, very close ties to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Houthi, they're allies, but they're very much their own force with their own agenda. And I think Iran could probably, they're close enough that Iran could probably pressure them to stop if they really wanted to. But I really do think it's the Houthis' own initiative, in solidarity with the Palestinians, to attack shipping in the Red Sea. And it's sort of there's just so little. I think the idea basically is that, hey, Western nations, you think that this doesn't affect you. You can see Palestinians slaughtered, and your economies and your ships, your whatever, you can just go on business as usual. But no, you can't go on business as usual. We're going to attack your ships. Now, fortunately, nobody's been killed in the Houthi attacks, and the damage has only been minor. But it's made enough shipping companies, or at least insurance companies, nervous enough that a lot of ships are going all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, and it certainly had a financial and other costs in terms of international commerce. And of course, the United States is there to defend international commerce, and has both to try to defend ships that were under attack, but has also launched some operations in Yemen itself. Now, as part of the broader question that you have around, and we were talking about Hezbollah, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about other things, will this be a wider war? That's the big worry that a lot of people have, and it's certainly possible. My sense is that it's not, and the reason is that whether you be hardcore Salafist groups, like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or whether you be these pro-Iranian groups like Hezbollah or the Houthis or Iran itself, this war has been a boon for them. It's eliminated any prospect of these pro-Western Arab kingdoms, recognizing Israel and forming a more solid alliance against the Salafists and the Iranians. It's made millions and millions of Muslims around the world more and more hostile to the West, and therefore more likely to be attracted to their extreme ideology. I mean, and they know if they tried to take on Israel, they get their butts kicked, because Israel has such a powerful force, and maybe even bring the U.S. involved as well. So why risk it when you can get all the political benefits by just stepping back and watching people get more and more angry at the West? Now, Israel is trying to provoke a larger war by far, so far, they've been relatively relatively I mean, the rocket attacks both in the Red Sea and in northern Israel have been quite limited, fairly small munitions. They haven't brought out the really heavy stuff that the Hezbollah and the Iranians have. So, but Israeli provocations could put things over the edge, and we've seen many cases where wars have started when neither side necessarily wanted a conflict, but things just tend to escalate and get out of hand. So I can't rule it out, but frankly, I don't think it's likely, just because it would not be in their interest to create a wider war. Yes. Yeah, yeah, right. I mean, it's well, you know, we were a vast majority of Americans were opposed to the Vietnam War, and it kept on going on and on and on. Central America, you know, all these. I mean, this is unfortunately this is not a new thing, and this is it's just really and it's incredibly frustrating. I mean, you know, I should be used to this, but I'm not. I'm furious. I mean, I have lost sleep. I have been very depressed and angry these months. I really have. And, you know, there are a lot of horrible things going on in the war, but the scale of killing, I mean, this is the most deadly conflict if you know, look at the numbers in so short a period of time of the 21st century. And our hands are all over it. You know, the United States is making it possible. So, yeah, I want to empathize. But, you know, as I say, we've stopped these wars before, and it's a combination of things. Everything from writing Congress and letters to the editor, to vigils, to protests, to civil disobedience. I like to see more nonviolent direct action, personally. I'm a little mixed about blocking bridges and that kind of thing. Some tactics, I sometimes wonder, you know, if it's the best way for building alliances or whatever. But certainly, can, you know, targeting congressional offices and other things. I mean, I think there's a role for a whole range of nonviolent tactics that we can apply. And I wish I could give a formula about what the best way to do things are. But I just, you know, keep struggling. And again, we've been in this situation before, and we eventually won. And again, when I talk about how younger Americans are, you know, they're going to be in office someday. In fact, some of them are the so-called squad, and others who are really being outspoken on this issue. And but the question is, you know, how many people are going to die in the interim? Yes. Yes. That's kind of silly, actually. First of all, the council resolution specifically called for the release of the hostages. And if you look at the hostages that were released, they were released because there was a ceasefire. Yeah, right. And, you know, that incident where the Israelis killed these hostages who were, you know, seeking their freedom. And in fact, they were going to leave the bodies there until somebody noticed that one of them was white, had red hair, and then they checked their IDs, you know, because basically their rules of engagement in northern Gaza is basically shoot everything that moves. And you're having hostage families who are protesting, calling for a ceasefire. Yeah. Neither Hamas nor Israel has openly called for that. Oh yeah, and I should mention there are thousands of Palestinians, nonviolent Palestinians, who are, including children, who are in Israeli prisons. None of the Palestinians released in return for the Israeli hostages were terrorists, despite what you know, some people were claiming. But, you know, frankly, I don't think Netanyahu cares. Like I say, you know, most of these hostages are kibbutzniks and ravers. They're not pro-Netanyahu. I mean, you know, he probably doesn't really care, and having the hostages is you know, a good political tool to try to justify the continued war. But no, we've seen when no hostages have been released while the war is going on, and the hostages have been released only when there's a ceasefire, and that should be pretty clear. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't there. I don't really know. Again, I think that there are again, it could be that they take this sort of old liberal paradigm that puts a special place for Israel and make exceptions for Israel. Some people may really see that. I think also that there are I mean there's some actually relatively progressive Jews who oppose it. I mean, Rabbi Paula Marcus is actually fairly decent on Palestine overall. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah, I don't either, but I think she because she is very respected in liberal circles in town. I think it would. I mean, in other words, were some people, largely Jewish, but not exclusively, who felt, who are pretty progressive on most things, that I think some members of City Council would take more seriously, that you did not have the equivalent people opposing resolutions on Iraq, or or some of the other things. And here's part of it. When I think about, some of you may have known the fiasco that happened when Scott Kennedy's when Chris Kennedy donated Scott's library to the Cowell Library. It was the Scott Kennedy Corner in the Cowell Library, which all his books about labor and Vietnam and peace and nonviolent action and Israel-Palestine and a bunch of other things. And the provost, in accepting it, it was an anniversary of his death, and there was a big, nice reception there, dedicating the Scott Kennedy Corner, and she announced that was not a standalone event, but it was going to be balanced by bringing in this far right-wing speaker who, supported the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, supported the war in Iraq, supports the war in Iran, says Muslims are the enemy. I mean, he was this really wacko, far right guy. And when we were asking, what the hell, what is this about? And it's because a Jewish friend had convinced her that Scott Kennedy was a supporter of Hamas, and there needed to be balance. Now, I said, come on, you're a provost, you have this PhD education, do you really think a left-wing Christian pacifist supports a right-wing Islamic terrorist group? And I said, why did you do this? And it's the same line I've gotten when I've had talks canceled, when I've been people have said I had to be balanced by a far right speaker afterwards, and that is that there is a default position among liberals, progressives, myself included, that if someone in a target group says someone is bigoted in some ways, there's a tendency to believe them. As a white person, who am I to say to a black person who calls out somebody as racist, oh, that's not racist? Or as a man, if a woman says, this is sexist, who am I as a man to say, oh, that's not sexist? And so a lot of people assume that if a Jewish person says that person is anti-Semitic, the default position is, well, they must know because they're Jewish, right? And people don't quite realize that that it's being used. Anti-Semitism is being weaponized to support this right-wing repressive government. You don't usually see that in these other cases. I mean, there's this. I remember some black activists called me a racist for opposing Mugabe one time, but we don't usually run into that, right? And so, I think that this is a very real phenomenon among many liberals, that when they have Jewish friends, who for many reasons do have kind of a blind spot towards Israel, tell them somebody, this is wrong or whatever, we tend to believe them. And again, every time I have been canceled in one way or another, the person making the decision was not a right-wing Zionist, was not a right-wing Zionist Jew. They were liberal Gentiles who believe their Jewish friends when they said nasty things about me. Right. Yes. Yes. Mm. Mhm. Mhm. Yes. So glad you said that. So glad you said that. And it's I mean, and yeah, the I mean, I cannot say I'm not anti-Semitic any more than I can say I'm not racist or I'm not sexist, because I grew up in a racist, sexist, anti-Semitic society, and we do our best to resist that, to not engage in microaggressions or worse. But yeah, we all have attitudes. We've all said things. We've all made assumptions, and that's very real. And I think there are, and indeed, in a lot of these one reason I actually, frankly, avoid some of the pro-Palestinian demonstrations, I think there are people who really do cross the line there, and I'm very uncomfortable about that. And so we need to acknowledge that fear. We need to acknowledge acknowledge that. And let me, I may get in hot water for saying this, but let me just say that that I personally have some moral qualms about abortion, but I don't talk about it because, one, I'm a man, and it's not my business. Two, I don't want to add to I believe that women have that choice. I don't want to say or anything that might strengthen the forces that want to deny that choice. And thirdly, I don't want to encourage those who oppose abortion not on pacifist reasons but for misogynist reasons. So so I keep mum about it, and I don't talk about it, I don't write about it, I just keep it kind of personally to myself. And I think there are a lot of people who kind of look that way, frankly, about Israel, because they're afraid that they may, and just as some of my personal feelings about abortion, if I said them more out loud or elaborated on them, might inadvertently encourage sexist and misogynist and et cetera, some people are concerned that criticizing Israel would encourage anti-Semitism. But the thing is that if we don't challenge U.S. support for Israel and Israeli policies for the right reasons, the movement is going to be dominated by people who do it for the wrong reasons. And I think an important thing we need to talk about is U.S. policy has not just denied, has not only failed to bring justice to the Palestinians. It's failed to bring security to Israel. And ultimately, Israeli security and Palestinian rights are not mutually exclusive, but mutually dependent on the other. And so the big myth is that opposing U.S. policy is opposing Israel, opposing Israelis. And it's not. And that's why I use that analogy of the drunk driver, that we, I think, and again, that's why my big theme tonight is let's focus on U.S. policy, not just criticizing Israel, even though Israel certainly deserves a lot of criticism. And again, I think also just again a lot of I have a number of Jewish friends who've taken surprisingly hawkish positions on this war, and I think the trauma of October 7th was really pretty acute. It was huge, and we need to do a lot of listening and not assume the worst, and again, acknowledge that very, very deep rooted fear that it really is rooted in centuries of oppression. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a couple of things are interesting. Well, I was surprised at the extent of the attack. One reason it succeeded was that Israel had 31 battalions outside of Israel in the West Bank supporting the right-wing settlers. In fact, the Gaza battalion even was helping this expansion against the Palestinian village at the time of the attack. And the Israelis actually had a detailed plan of the attack a year ago, but apparently said that, they just thought it was aspirational. They didn't take it seriously. Didn't think they were capable of doing this. Now, this has led to conspiracy theories, just as the intelligence failures around 9/11 led to conspiracy theories. I don't believe either were conspiracies myself. I think it really was hubris and a whole bunch of other serious failures, and it actually hasn't helped Netanyahu. His popularity has gone way down because he ran on, only I can protect you. Only he had a Trump-style kind of, only I can protect you. With me, you'll be secure. And that was the whole, basis of his campaign. And that sure screwed him up. So, yeah, it actually hurt his popularity, and I think he would have known that. So I don't believe there was an outright a conspiracy. But, again, it just seems so criminal that Israel's screw-ups, strategically, has been resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of Palestinians. See, who hasn't spoken yet? Yeah, go ahead. He's taken some crazy right-wing positions and some progressive positions on a number of issues. On Israel-Palestine, he's actually not that different than other more mainstream, political figures. His father was killed by a Palestinian. Maybe he has some personal grudges there, but unlike I know his sister Carrie with the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Campaign. She's been a very big advocate for Palestine. Though another brother, Chris Kennedy, was really anti-Palestinian. He led that effort to fire Steve Saleta from his job at the University of Illinois. The family's mixed, but Robert Kennedy Jr. Is pretty bad on Israel-Palestine, as frankly I think he is on a number of issues. Oh yeah, the diversity in the Jewish community is a really, really important, been a really important step forward. even within the Zionist movement, you have J Street, which has been identifies as Zionist, but is anti-occupation, and though it hasn't supported a ceasefire, it has supported restrictions on Israel's bombing and the large-scale casualties there. Then you had Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, which are Jewish groups. JVP is explicitly anti-Zionist. If Not Now doesn't take a position one way or another, but they've been leading some of these nonviolent direct actions, which basically under the theme of not in our name. And I think that's been very, very important, and it's cast a whole different light on the debate that we haven't had in the past, where there is a seeming unity in the Jewish community regarding Israel. And I feel much more comfortable, shall I say, at demonstrations led by these groups. And it's just part of this growing movement, and it's real impressive as someone who's worked on this issue for over 45 years to see so many people engaged, including people who have not been involved in this issue before. And both people who've been veterans of peace efforts over the decades, but have avoided Israel-Palestine up till now, as well as a new generation of mobilized activists, particularly young people of color, which is very significant. But I notice people are starting to fade a little bit. Some people are leaving, so this might be a good time to close. Again, sign up to my email list if you'd like, and also be happy to answer questions individually. Thanks for coming out.